Time after time after time, we hear and read about breaches, and sometimes it's very surprising because in many cases, breaches can be prevented. The breaches can be mitigated. And the best way to prevent a breach is to understand how the adversary is thinking. What are their tactics? What are their techniques? What are their procedures? But also, what is important to them as a person as well. We have an exciting live stream today. We're going to be speaking about the cybersecurity attackers playbook with a defender's mindset. We're going to be looking at MITRE ATT&CK, zero trust, and most importantly, how to prevent breaches. Run the intro.
Who says tech can't be human?
Welcome back to the show. I am so excited for this live stream because we don't speak about breaches enough. I think that there's a lot of resources, a lot of information out there that talks about the fact that a breach happened, but what about what happened during that breach? How do you stop it? What are some of the ways that it happened in the first place? To kick things off, though, we have an amazing partner that we've worked with throughout the past year. We started by speaking to their CEO, and then we went to their conference. And now here we are doing a live stream with them today. Our sponsor and valued partner is ThreatLocker. Big shout outs to ThreatLocker. If you haven't done so already, be sure to follow ThreatLocker. Check out the ThreatLocker website. From going to their conference, Zero Trust World, it was the one conference that's hosted by a cybersecurity company where their attendees, their customers, their partners were obsessed. I think every company has a lot to learn when it comes to ThreatLocker because of their product. For one, it's focused on zero trust, but also the fact that they have an obsessed customer base, which is always great. I have two amazing guests with me that are cybersecurity engineers at ThreatLocker. Let's go ahead and bring them in. Please join me in welcoming Ivan Fonseca and Nick Cottrell, both cybersecurity engineers at ThreatLocker. What's going on, gentlemen?
How you guys doing? How's everybody doing?
Doing great. So let's jump right into it, right? I mentioned that breaches are a common piece of the news. It seems like cybersecurity is now in the mainstream because of breaches. And I was really inspired after speaking to you two both at Zero Trust World, but also when we were planning out this episode, because you all have a offensive background, but use the offensive understanding and knowledge that you have to apply towards cybersecurity defense. So we'd love for you all to give us a quick briefing on your background, 1 to 2 minutes. Let's start with you, Ivan.
All right, so my very first background came from cloud consulting. Then later I got picked up by this amazing company that is ThreatLocker. And here I mainly focus on threat detection. I also do some DFIR, so digital forensics and incident response. And obviously the funnest part I'd like to say is the red teaming aspect of it, because we're able to translate these techniques, tactics, and procedures used by hackers. And through threat intelligence, we're able to create proper threat detection policies.
Love. Passing over to you, Nick.
All right, so I started off as a software developer that got into security because I wanted to make better code, something I'd have to just write once and not have to rewrite 20 different times because someone found some sort of loophole somewhere that let them do more than I wanted them to do. And while I was going through computers, I started learning that breaking things is actually kind of fun. And sometimes more fun than actually securing it, even though it's also very rewarding to have something that is very difficult for someone to get into. So going through there, I ended up getting picked up by ThreatLocker, and the rest is history.
Awesome. So let's talk about some breaches. When we first met, there was two that really stood out to all of us, but we're going to start with just one. The first one I wanted to bring up is 3CX. For anyone that hasn't seen the information and the news on that breach, it was a chained supply chain attack. I never heard of anything like that before this breach, because usually when you hear a supply chain attack, it's just focused on one supply chain. But 3CX was ultimately compromised because of another supply chain attack, and then that affected their supply chain. When you all saw this news break, what was going through your mind as offensive operators and defenders? Let's start with you, Nick.
All right. So for that scenario, what I noticed is that the majority of attackers nowadays, their priority is going to be trying to hit a supply chain. And it kind of makes sense because, especially in the era we're at now, where everyone is actually pretty focused on security, getting into a company or any kind of system is already going to be a bit of an uphill battle. So trying to find some sort of bug or exploit in something takes a long time, and ultimately it's just going to get patched out anyway as soon as someone else finds it. So ultimately for most hackers, the easier option is just, hey, if I can't find my own bug or exploit, what if I can make my own bug or exploit?
Right.
And I can put it in software that everyone trusts. And just because that idea is a lot more reliable, and especially since you're not then having to rely on everyone having an older version, if you could put that into the latest version, people will intentionally infect themselves without knowing. It's the easiest opportunity.
I find it really exciting, the fact that someone would think to do that. I feel like that's such a bold move to change someone's source code and then put malicious content within it. And if someone were to do that, then they could swim around. I feel like now you have lateral movement through other mechanisms. So, like, if I were to have a piece of software, right? ThreatLocker focuses on zero trust. If I were to have a specific piece of software that's already installed, one piece of software that I use that most other people use is Slack. If I'm using something like Slack and I've given it permission, I've already vetted the software, how do I avoid finding myself in a predicament being in like this supply chain chained attack?
Alrighty, so definitely in a case where you have a application that's trusted, and we can talk about Slack, or we can also talk about a common attack vector known as living off the land binaries. These are those binaries that are natively installed in your Windows environment. They aren't inherently bad, but they can conduct malicious behavior or be leveraged by malicious actors to do bad actions. In that case, we have a product in place called ring fencing. What we do is we try to limit the capabilities that applications have. You can say, okay, that application is safe, but let's put some constraints on it. Let's try to limit its communication with other applications. Let's try to limit its communication with the registry, and let's try to limit its capabilities to reach out to the internet. So by doing these things, even though we have a trusted application, we can use a zero trust, basically theory, and put it into practice by limiting the constraints of which this application, or the capabilities that this application has.
This idea of ring fencing, especially if we're looking at something like ThreatLocker, is this done pre-execution or is this done in memory as well? Where is the fence at?
Yeah, so that one's going to be, correct me if I'm wrong, Ivan, but it's in memory, I believe. It's on active usage. The ring fence runs pretty much the entire time, and even if your application doesn't, say, try to access the internet now, it will get stopped as soon as it does try. And then the ring fence might give it an alert saying that, hey, by the way, this application tried to do something. And something I also wanted to add from that question earlier, a practice that's done in red teaming, I remember when I was first doing my studies on malware, especially for Windows, a thing called process injection. It's where you would take a bunch of regular code and then inject it into an already running process or application. And I remember one of the first practices I had to do with that was make Notepad run command prompt, which it's like a rite of passage for being able to do it. But at least with ring fencing, if you know what the application should do, you can also tell it what it shouldn't do. For example, Notepad should not be able to run executables and should be stopped immediately. And then the same thing with Slack. Slack should be allowed to access the internet, but it shouldn't need to run a command or try to post something else. And when it comes to network usage, that can also be limited. Or even back with Notepad, again, Notepad should not be able to execute a process, and there's no way that Notepad, the executable, can even access the internet. So it should be red flag as soon as you see it do that.
So I love this idea of looking at treating this like a fence. And I would imagine that ring fencing is probably also tied into the kernel. Like the kernel has rings to it. There's specific accesses and permissions that you're allowed to do depending on which ring you're at, especially on a Windows operating system. And I would imagine that this is associated with the kernel on Windows. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. We live at the kernel level, is how we like to tell people. So we're able to intercept those API calls from Windows NT, and that's when we're able to stop it before it even reaches the operating, well, obviously the front end of the operating system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that Notepad example, opening up getting a shell. I remember that in my early days of trying to learn about reverse engineering, learning about how to gain a shell on a device. One thing that I wanted to talk to you all about is looking at this breach of 3CX. Let's look at it from an attacker's perspective to start. We talked about how some applications could lead to access that's not necessarily necessary. But if you all were doing an offensive operation on Hacker Valley or ThreatLocker, what's going on in your mind trying to get an application to ultimately live off the land or gain access to other data or applications?
I think the very first step is truly understanding the application. And as hackers, that's something that we have to do emphasis on. Hackers essentially understand applications as best as they possibly can. So I'm talking about reading through documentation, and obviously just testing with prior vulnerabilities that we know of. Like we know sometimes they'll do a security patch, but it'll only be a piece of what's truly in danger. So we can try to retest the vulnerabilities, and sometimes a small tweak can make an application vulnerable again. And I talk about that reconnaissance phase, right? That enumeration phase. That's the first step for any hacker, is to truly understand the landscape that they're working in and the application that they're going against.
Yeah, another example on that is that if your system utilizes a remote accessing program like Teams, and I'm trying to break in, why would I try to add in my own backdoors or try to create my own remote access and put on a reverse shell when I can just get the password for your Teams and log in that way? Problem with that then is that if I were to do that, when you finally go back and start looking at responses, it becomes hard to tell, all right, so which one of these logins was legitimate and which one of these might say that someone else got in when they weren't supposed to.
I have to jump in for a second to share some details about our sponsor for this episode, ThreatLocker. It's no secret that one wrong click can lead to a catastrophic cyber attack. And nobody has time to keep reminding your employees about the consequences of running unpermitted software on their devices. Cyber attacks are devastating to any business, and without the correct solutions in place, your organization may be at risk. Fortunately, ThreatLocker recognizes that cybersecurity starts at the endpoint, and they've built a zero-trust endpoint protection platform that strengthens your cyber defenses from the ground up. If you're looking for a proactive solution that will keep you better protected in the face of cyber threats, check out ThreatLocker by visiting ThreatLocker.com and tell them Hacker Valley sent you. I'm always curious as to what's going on in someone's head when they're doing an op, especially like from an offensive standpoint. I used to work at Booz Allen Hamilton, and I was a contractor for the NSA. And part of my job was to, do offensive ops. And I would have my own internal feelings, especially if I'm living off the land. I feel good. I'm comfortable. I'm sitting back because I'm using things that already exist. I'm not trying to break any application and make it perform in a specific way. But when I was doing some sort of exploitation using code that doesn't exist in that application, I would get the butterflies. I'd feel a little nervous. For you all, and even from anything that you've seen from your own research, what's going on in an adversary's mind now when they're, going through this operation?
I mean, living off the land binaries are definitely something we're seeing, and that's constantly reoccurring in the environment. I think the most sophisticated hackers and the best hackers are the ones that leverage living off the land binaries because, like you said, it's a peace of mind. The binaries are already on the system, and they kind of carry a small footprint in terms of when that security analyst or the incident response team is looking through. It's harder to analyze living off the land binaries because they're already there and we know how they act. So we're kind of more looking for the same usage of those binaries, obviously the same way your administrators would use it, but we're looking for different capabilities or functions spawned off of those binaries. Obviously, when you present a new binary into an environment that isn't native to the system, so we're not talking about living off the land binaries, those are more easily caught by your signature detection systems and maybe even heuristic detection.
Which part of, I think a lot of people will look at something like MITRE ATT&CK to, understand what techniques were used, to understand what part of the kill chain a specific attack or breach is part of. When you look at something like living off the land, we have initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential access. I feel like if you're living off the land, you're kind of like touching all of those boxes. Which area is like, where do you typically have the opportunity to start preventing further, access or further compromise? Is it during that initial access when they first gain access and try to pivot to another application or another data resource? What have you all seen to be like the most opportune moment to defend against an attack that's living off the land?
Well, that's pretty much where with our software, the first part is that since we're a whitelisting application, it's not like hackers may be able to bring in their own tools to do their own reconnaissance. At that point, then they're going to have to figure things out on their own. But with a tool as well, you get to see all of the actions that the computer does. And it's perfect for us as well, because if you end up running on the system and you do something that you're not allowed to do, we see all of that. So by going out and exploring, you end up revealing yourself.
Yeah.
And they deal with a bit of a double-edged sword there. They need to do more reconnaissance and they need to learn more about the system. But by learning about the system, they end up revealing more about themselves. And they end up having to use they have to use binaries that are already on their lay of the land. But the problem there is with ring fencing, you end up being limited as to what applications can do. So sure, they get access to a machine and they have access to Slack. They can't get administrator from Slack. They can start sending messages to people and start giving some fun little jokes. But if they do decide to, problem there is we have a program that's called Detect, part of our MDR solution, along with ThreatLocker. And it's basically, we have a bunch of people on call watching for any alerts that we put out for these lay of the land. Because we can't stop you from using it. If we stop you from using binaries that are essential to your machine, you either can't get your job done or you break the system. So we can't stop that, but we can still watch to see when something bad happens. And when we do, we can then have our own responses. And if enough odd and suspicious things happen, you get a call from us and you immediately know that someone is on your system doing something.
Got you. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I love the fact that you all are also helping monitor. And with, something like zero trust, you always hear default deny, block by default, try to never trust, always verify. And when I was at Zero Trust World, hosted by ThreatLocker, a lot of the attendees that I spoke to, they said that one of the reasons why they liked working with you all was the fact that you do a default deny. I've never heard of that. I've never heard of a default deny besides ThreatLocker, because a lot of people, when they hear about that, they get nervous. They say, oh, my CEO is he's not gonna go for that because they're so busy and they just like to have it their way. So how do you get people to have this mindset of, I'm sure you talk to them about ring fencing. It sounds exciting, but when they think about their executives, they might have a little heartburn. How do you all kind of articulate that to the prospect and customers for you all?
Yeah, so that's one of the main concerns usually when I talk about the product, but it's not concerning. It's obviously reassuring the customer of just the functionalities of the product themselves. we like to take the theory of zero trust and put it into a practical and easier level, I guess you can say. So we like to take the theory of zero trust world and we like to put it into practice within our code. So our product basically allows you to enforce zero trust at an easier level. And what I say about this is we can think about an example, right? We can think about a secretary. He or she only uses Adobe. Maybe they use Word, maybe Excel, maybe a browser too. Maybe they like Google Chrome over Edge. That's a personal preference, obviously. At that point, when you first install the ThreatLocker agent on the machine, it'll learn your behavior for 21 days. And this is where it becomes easy, right? We have that allow listing solution. You can think about it just like that. It's that whitelist. Whatever's in the whitelist is allowed to run. Everything outside of that list is blocked by default. But with that machine learning algorithm, when we first install on your machine, we learn your user's behavior for 21 days. Then our team verifies what's added to that whitelist, and they say, hey, this is good, this is verified, this is validated. And then your machine goes into secure mode. It blocks everything by default. But at this point, some people get scared. They're like, okay, what if I want new software on my machine? We say,
Right.
well, don't worry. If you need new software, something will get denied. A little pop-up will come up in the right-hand section saying, hey, this application has been denied. Do you want to request it for approval? Do you want it to be added to your whitelist? Once you click that, immediately our team is 24/7 around the clock watching these approvals, and these are trained security analysts watching over your endpoints. This is apart from the MDR product all of itself. This is what we call the approvals team, which falls into the response team that also handles the MDR alerts. But this is a team that all they do is validate that those applications that you were requesting to be added to your whitelist. You're saying, hey, I want to play games on my machine. Let's go ahead and add Steam. That team will go back and say, hey, Steam is good to go. We'll run it against VirusTotal and this amazing environment that we have called the VDI, so the virtual desktop environment.
Hmm.
And basically what that'll do is check canaries, check VirusTotal, check what that binary is doing at your file system, what it's doing in the registry, and what type of network calls it's doing, and the files that it's spawning in your file system. So nothing gets past us, right? At that point, those analysts can validate and say this application is good. And if it's not, obviously they can decline it and escalate it to your team so you can further analyze it and come to a final decision.
When I see zero trust spoken about, there's so many different vantage points. Some people focus on, network, where they were like, all right, I'm going to try to do zero trust across my network, maybe because they have a sensitive infrastructure. It could be a financial institution. Network communication is going to be very sensitive and important to protect in that aspect. And then others will say, well, I want to focus on my applications and I'll try to do some type of identity and access management on the application or have some type of broker manage that. And then on the other hand, there's the endpoint where you all focus. Looking at the history of the company, having so many different pillars of zero trust that you can apply zero trust towards, what makes endpoint very beneficial, or even like the top number one piece to focus on when it comes to zero trust?
So for the endpoint, the thing is that the reason why I focus on the endpoint is because that's where everything happens. If an attacker is trying to get onto the machine, all of network traffic is going to go to that machine. So they're going to see any incoming or even outgoing communications on their end. They're also going to see when someone locally on the machine tries to do something. Because something I remember as well is that hacking and attackers doesn't always come from an external internet. Sometimes it's internal. So you have to monitor not just for remote network attacks, but also if someone were trying to do something directly on the machine. So the benefit of doing it from the endpoint is that it allows us to secure right where the actual vulnerability and where the attack is going to be coming at or pointed straight at. With the way I look at it is that looking at things from the network is getting the big picture. It's seeing everything all at once, while the endpoint is getting the details and figuring out the details all together. And while it is a good idea to have the big picture, the thing is that just going by the details, but then spreading amongst every separate machine, that ends up giving you a lot more coverage and way more insight than you might expect.
I could totally see that. If I could only protect one thing, it would definitely be the endpoint, because if I can get my users protected, then it should have positive downstream effects on my network, and it should have positive downstream effects on my applications. All of those things should be a little bit more clean and secure and not tampered with by the adversary. What has been the most common attack vector that you all have seen for, blocking things on the endpoint? Is it supply chain and, people living off the land, or is it actually binaries that adversaries are creating and trying to use within that endpoint?
I think it's a mixture of a little bit of everything. Like I said, lately we've been seeing a lot more living off the land binaries. It's just the nature of our product. So if someone, which is extremely rare, someone does manage to get in, and we have some funny stories about hackers getting in, and in one of the cases they couldn't run Mimikatz over and over on the machine, and they continuously try to do this. Obviously, they were bringing the binary over, they downloaded it, they were just getting denied. So they're like, you know what? I'm just gonna send it up to the request team, and they sent it up to a request team. And it seems like, what in the world? You guys have Mimikatz on you. This is pre-MDR phase. So then that's almost instantly we were able to catch on, that endpoint was breached.
An
And obviously it
attacker
was blocked by default.
requested Mimikatz to be approved by ThreatLocker.
Precisely. They were kind of sick of it. Yeah. And in other cases, obviously, we see more than ever, we see living off the land binaries, because that's the way some attackers think they can get through our software. But little do they know, I mean, we have a team full of threat detection engineers, and there's a project called the Lawbass project, and this basically covers most of the living off the land binaries. It's an open source project, amazing project, by the way. We have covered most of that project itself in terms of building threat detection policies around each and every single one of those binaries, as well as living off the land drivers.
I think, looking back 10, 15 years ago, it might have been a little bit more of a challenge to do something like a whitelist, because there was a lot more applications. Like, your email was its own thick app, and some people still use the thick app version of their email and calendar. And then you had, your full Adobe suite, and a lot more people use SaaS apps today. So I feel like to whitelist applications, it's a lot more manageable. And I think it's something that people should consider if they're not already doing. I'm interested in hearing how your product would protect against internal threats. Looking at things like, do you all use behavior analytics? I think that you said there's that learning period, but I'll allow one of you all to jump in and answer that one.
Yeah, so in terms of behavior analytics, it goes back to that heuristic detection that I'm talking about with our EDR product, which is ThreatLocker Detect, and obviously the MDR product being in addition to it, which allows basically just our team to manage it for you instead of that hassle having to be on your internal SOC team. So basically through behavioral based analysis, we've created threat detection policies that look for, the malicious use of different binaries that could be used by insiders, or the exfiltration of data from an insider to an outside source. So we have a huge suite of policies covering this. And I like to tell people a lot, signature detection is amazing for stopping known threats. But that behavioral detection, or that heuristic detection, is amazing for catching the new threats. Because signature detection basically is a bunch of hashes or paths or names of files that could potentially or have been malicious in the past. That's amazing for stopping those. But what we have to be focusing on is what behavior binaries are showing in an environment. That helps us understand, hey, is this bad or is this good? And it helps us make good conclusions and stop attacks.
Powerful. I love that.
And to add on to that as well, since our learning mode is supposed to learn what the applications that are running on the server or whatever machine it's running on, it also means that it could also disallow or blacklist applications that you just don't use at all. So, like, for example, in a file share, even though like a file share is supposed to have access so that you can be able to remotely grab documents or put documents in there. So things like Samba and FTP will be allowed since they are constantly being used, and it's normal traffic. It's normal daily usage. But then things like a web browser will not be used because it's a file share who's logging into it and trying to grab things from the internet on there, or trying to print documents from that file share. But it allows for more fine tuning so that because the idea is that you don't want everyone to be running every machine like it is a workstation. Some things will need to be completely headless and left alone. So the only things that should be allowed to run or connect are things that are either too allowed to run or like access for maintenance and stuff.
And one thing I did forget, we haven't talked about, is extremely important, is we do have a unified audit. So when we're talking about telemetry, that is the source. That is the father of everything. All the telemetry from the endpoint is forwarded or sent over to our unified audit. And you can think about it a lot like a SIM or a SIEM, however you may say it. This is where we store, write, read, execute actions, registry changes, network calls, and just a bunch of telemetry that's pulled off of the endpoint that can aid us in even understanding breaches or just understanding what's happening on your endpoint at any moment, any given time.
Love that.
And fun fact as well, did you know that 7-Zip is a Russian application? I did not know that it was made by Russians until I found out through our descriptions and one of our demos. So we have a lot of descriptions on applications like these all over, and even some browser extensions, because there are some that even things such as like coupon extensions.
Yes.
Some of them are pretty sound. Some of them are made in places that are considered pretty safe. Some are Chinese and ask for a lot more permissions than it realistically should, including being able to run things on the system. And we have people that actively research all of these applications to find out who it is made by and what kind of things can they do, what kind of gains do they have by it running on your system.
I'm glad that you brought up Chrome extensions, because I think that's one area that could break people's zero trust strategy, right? You look at all of your applications and you say, Chrome, any browser that supports extensions, okay, cool. Like, this is a whitelist. But then that browser is essentially running an executable in the form of JavaScript through the extension. How do you all, I guess, protect against that? How do you think about that from a zero trust standpoint?
Yeah, so once again, coming back to the principle of least privilege, if you don't need it on your environment, you shouldn't have it. But a cool thing, and I think Nick touched up on it a little bit, he said we have templates for applications, and we do. These are called built-ins. And we have built-ins for extensions as well. We have over 3,500 built-ins that are validated, verified, and we have a huge team of people who basically stay up to date with the latest updates and continue to feed basically our application. We call them application definitions. It's basically you can think about an empty bin, and we feed into it hashes and file paths, and we keep it up to date with what's safe and secure software. So for example, if you need a known extension, the chances are it's probably already in one of our built-ins, and then you can sleep safe at night knowing that we already catalog it and we view it.
Love that.
The nice thing as well is that, again, if it isn't something that we catalog, that's when you request it to one of our support people and they get someone else to download it on one of our virtual machines and figure out what does it do. We get a whole team to try and research what it does. And then now, just a couple days later, we have a new built-in.
One thing that I love about cybersecurity that is happening now is we're starting to focus on language and communication. When I first got started, I remember used to trying to explain to people using technical terms. I thought, if I could just be a little bit more technical, then they'd understand me. And that wasn't the case. And I think now, especially speaking to so many CISOs, so many security leaders, they understand you got to speak the language of everyone else. You got to speak the language of the business, of the culture of the organization. And I think that, when you refer to things like the 3CX breach, it puts things into perspective, but you still have to use terminology like zero trust. So for anyone out there that is trying to start that journey of introducing their organization to zero trust, how would you all recommend to describe that concept to your stakeholders for them to understand easily?
One way that I describe it is, and I bring in the principle of least privilege, and I tell them, well, if you don't use an application in your environment, then what's the reason you should have it? And then I tell them, give me a good reason. Like, well, I don't know, I don't use it, I don't need it. I'm like, exactly. But these are the same tools that hackers can leverage to take over your environment, and we don't even realize it. But we're giving the hackers the tools they need to take over our own endpoints. So let's stop doing that. Not only that, it's certain privileges you can think about, like Cloud IAM, right? Why are your cloud users, why is somebody that just interfaces with S3 buckets or cloud buckets allowed to spin up EC2 instances? It just doesn't make sense, right? So just limiting it down and explaining to them that it's just the principle of only allowing what you absolutely need. and blocking everything else, or just not giving the rights to anything else.
Simple, elegant. Nick, what about you? If someone, one of your customers said, "Hey, Nick, I need help. How do I explain this zero trust thing to my organization? We want to finish our rollout of ThreatLocker." How would you kind of help them articulate that?
It's better to decide what you want versus what you don't want. Because the whole point of zero trust is it's a whitelist. It's what do you want? Only allow what you want.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way of least privilege, what do you want? When do you want it? How do you want it? If you can keep a mindset and are able to answer these questions, that would give you a security that is nigh unbeatable. Meanwhile, like that list for what you want is going to be a lot shorter than, okay, what do you not want? Because I can tell you all sorts of things like, oh, I don't know, I don't want Mimikatz, I don't want Nmap, I don't want all these other tools, I don't want something like Burp Suite, because, or it's like, what do you want to give everyone? Well, I don't want to give our secretary the ability to try and break into our admin using something like Hydra or a Kerberos. So that list is just going to get longer and longer. And the problem with going at it in that perspective is that there will always be some sort of loophole or something that you forgot to say that you didn't want. Someone will eventually find something or some way to be able to get around it. So ultimately, it's a lot easier just to say, what do you want? And ignore everything else.
That's the way. That's the way. Focus on what you can, and then as things come up, address them at that point. You don't have to try to boil the ocean. I think that's where we end up getting caught up in a lot of situations. I appreciate the definition and how to communicate that. Hopefully someone that's watching this kind of like is able to speak to their stakeholders a little bit better. I think that's what, our roles and responsibility is all about, is effectively communicating your value to the rest of the team. Ivan, I gotta bring you back up for a second. You have a hacking series. I love, learning from the best. One of the things that I mentioned when we first got started the stream is one of the best ways to prevent breaches is to have an attacker's mindset. So what is this hacking series that you created, and why did you create it in the first place?
Yeah, so it comes back to that red team first mentality, and it also blends in what you were saying about the technicality of things. And sometimes us as professionals, we tend to inundate people with this technical jargon that they don't understand. I'm trying to take that stigma away from cybersecurity and be able to speak everyone's language. So the Hacker Beginning series is basically me going over many hacking tools like Nmap, Hashcat. You can think of things like Burp Suite. And all I'm teaching is just simple, basic syntax behind these tools, how to use them or how hackers use them. For example, the Nmap video that I released a couple weeks ago, I think it's been a month now, I just teach you the basic syntax of Nmap and how to launch your first scans per se. So when you get to launch your own scans, you get your hands-on experience. You start to understand, okay, this is how this tool is used. These are the capabilities that it has. So if hackers can do this, what should I do to stay aware and stop these type of threats? So I'm trying to take it away from that technical jargon standpoint and make it more accessible to everybody so everyone can understand it.
And where could people check out this series, Hacking Beginning?
They can check it out on our YouTube channel.
Okay, nice. Great. So I have to ask another question, especially about ThreatLocker. You all were kind enough to sponsor this stream and be a great partner to Hacker Valley. What else should the audience know about ThreatLocker?
I like to tell people that, for starters, we actually care. And I don't just say that because I work for ThreatLocker. I'm here every single day, day in and day out, and my team will put in extra hours if it's necessary to help our customers understand what they're onboarding and what they're doing. We make something that's inherently hard, because the truth is implementing zero trust, it's not easy. And that's what everybody tells us. So we're trying to make it easier for you. We're trying to help you implement zero trust in your infrastructure in an easy and accessible way.
Love that. Ivan, Nick, thank you so much for spending some time with me and our audience. I'm a big fan of ThreatLocker. For anyone that hasn't already checked out ThreatLocker, be sure to check them out. They are building something special, and they really care. Like Nick was saying, they truly care. I've been to Zero Trust World hosted by ThreatLocker, and let me tell you, their customers are in love. Their partners are in love. I am in love. So be sure to check them out. And with that, we will see everyone next time.